Now, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are now going to start on the last discussion of this course, the last lecture. We have two last papers to look at, submitted by students. The first one is the moral and the practical, and we're going to look at this as we did the two last time, from the aspect of its ability to present philosophic ideas objectively, interest the audience, present it clearly, self-containedly. Now, you've read this, and let's begin by asking you for a generalized assessment. Would you say this is essentially positive, mixed, or negative? This first paper, starting on page 14, the moral and the practical. I'll ask you by show of hands, how many would say that it is essentially positive? Quite a small sprinkling of hands. How many would say essentially mixed? Significantly larger. And how many would say essentially negative? That seems to me about a tie between mixed and negative, perhaps a little more on the side of mixed. I would myself agree with the last two assessments, somewhere in between. I wouldn't go so far as to say essentially negative, because I think there are good things and good intentions in this paper, but I think there are some real problems that would pull me to the lower mixed division. But let us see from the outset. Those who think that this is essentially good, what would you say is essentially the virtues of this paper? Now, the fact that you're in a minority doesn't mean I'm going to necessarily argue with you, because I do think there are good things in this paper. Yes?
I believe it sets forth the problem in a good manner.
You say he sets forth the problem in a good and correct manner. The problem being what? That most people think that there's a dichotomy between the moral and the practical, and he's going to challenge that.
Also, the effects that are in the present context.
Well, in other words, you say plus the effects of this in the present context. So you think it's good as far as motivating the audience is concerned.
Yes.
How many would agree with that assessment, that it's good as far as motivating the audience? And that's a fair number. How many would say it's not? Well, let's see if you would say it's not. If you'd say it is, presumably it's because you see that he ties it, or attempts to tie it at least, to all kinds of actual issues on people's mind. He doesn't just discuss it in a vacuum. He brings in right from the outset inflation, the energy crisis, the Soviet Union, just to pick a few. That second paragraph, I may say, seems to me repetitive, because you're elaborating on problems we already know, and in 3 pages, every word is precious. So once you say inflation once, either it gets them or it doesn't, but to say it's approaching 20% in the next paragraph is too much. But all right, you take a dig at the government in the 3rd paragraph. That's okay, it's not essential. Then you say there are answers to these, and my answers depend upon my view of the moral and the practical, and I'm going to even tell you what my solutions are. So if people were afraid that this was a floating abstraction, you've certainly taken care that you're going to tie it to all kinds of real practical things. And in that regard, I see you're still giving motivation near the bottom of page 15, because you notice the 3rd last paragraph, you say to provide some motivation. So you've given approximately 1/3 of your paper to motivating. Now, that might suggest to you that there's some error involved, because on a thing like the moral and the practical is not that esoteric. See, if it was the primacy of consciousness, I could see, you'd think, oh, this audience is going to be turned off completely if they're not graduate students, so I really have to lay on the motivation thick, otherwise they're going to tune out. But the moral and the practical is not that esoteric. It's not that treacherous. So if you see that you're using up close to a third of the paper and you're still trying to motivate them to get interested in it, there's a question there whether that makes sense. But there's a bigger problem than that. So I'm turning now to the negative side of your motivation. The positive is you did try to tie it to the real issues that people would be interested in, but what is the problem with the way that you did it? Who would see a problem in this kind of introduction? Now actually the introduction continues on really until when? Till somewhere on page 16. You're still trying to get them to see there's a question here you're going to answer. Where do you actually start to give your answer on the moral and the practical, what their relationship is, which is the theme of the paper?
The third paragraph.
On the third last paragraph, right, is where you start. Isn't that correct? Or you think you start on the third paragraph on page 16, third from the top. But you don't really start to present your view there. What are you presenting there, the third paragraph on page 16? The historical source of the wrong view, right? So we don't get to know your view of the moral and the practical. You don't actually address that until where?
You're right, the second.
Till starting near the bottom of page 16, right? And what is the length of your actual presentation of the moral and the practical? It really starts the second last paragraph on page 16, and it's over where? The theory, the straight theory, which is the essence of your theme.
I would say the theory's over in the middle of page 17.
Well, it's over before, you say the middle of page 17, it's over before that because your second paragraph on page 17 is let's go and see an example of how the two, so you're already applying it to an example, right? So the actual theory, which is the nub of your paper, is what? Is about 2 paragraphs in the middle. And the rest is an extended introduction and then an extended example. Now that already suggests that there's a question of strategy and of approach here because it's not that complex a problem requiring that much motivation or that much elaboration. Now let's go back to what is the problem with that long and detailed a motivational introduction. What does it leave you with as it stands right here? Yes?
One thing, instead of motivating, you could lose interest.
You say instead of motivating, you could lose interest, and it could work that way for what reason?
That it takes us too long to get...
And what is the issue there? Not simply that it's too long, because it's not that it's repetitive. He doesn't keep saying the same thing. He tells you, look at all these problems, and a whole bunch of, real-life problems. That there are solutions. Now, you may think there aren't solutions, but that's because you have a certain theory of the moral and the practical. Now, before I tell you what my theory of the moral and the practical is, here are my solutions to these. In brief, in inflation, I'd say this. In energy crisis, I'd say this. On Iran, I'd say this, and so on. Now, you may object that this violates so-and-so, but that's because you have a wrong theory, which goes back to ancient Greece. And now we're on page 16. You're giving the historical roots. And what is happening to the mind of the reader in one 4-letter word? There's the Crow epistemology. You're pouring it on, you see. And he doesn't yet have anything to attach to. So as I was reading it and trying to put myself in the position that I don't know the answer, and I'm just trying to read it, so many unanswered questions piled up in my mind that I began to feel, that the pressure is growing and growing, and I kept tuning out. And then, of course, I'd, start myself back again, but it was simply too much. So I think the main objection is you chose a motivation which would really be interesting if you had a book. Because then you could say, I'm going to answer everything by reference to this. And let's have one chapter to show you all the kinds of questions and historical background and so on. Take your time, go out and have coffee, go to bed. Now tomorrow we'll come back. But this is hit and run, you see. It's 1, 2, 3. So you can't load that kind of structure on your reader. What would be an alternative type of motivation that wouldn't put that type of pressure on you that you could do more briefly? for this type of subject. If you were doing this subject and you didn't want to get involved in being overwhelmed with too much material in advance, what type of motivation might you try? Yes. In the blonde, yes. Give a few examples. Well, I don't even think you need a few. In fact, I'm not convinced that on this case you even need one example as a motivation, because everybody knows the issue of the moral and the practical. And everybody has heard that, and most people recite, oh, it may be moral, but it's not practical, and the two are opposed to each other. So the essence of your paper is a headlong attack at a bromide that most people accept. And they know that that's an important issue. They know that they preach things as moral that they wouldn't dream of acting on, and that if they had to live by them, you know, they'd be in real trouble, and that therefore they think this is obvious, and this guy must be saying something, you know, fantastic and certainly intriguing if he says that my whole thing is wrong. In other words, on this type of moral issue, which is so well known, and your position is so revolutionary, very little is needed to motivate an audience. You just have to simply come in head on and say, in effect, now I'm not wording it, but the idea would be, you think you can say something is moral but not practical, you live by that, I say that's wrong, it's leading to disaster, and the moral and the practical always go together. And if you just said that intriguingly, virtually that briefly, that would pick up anybody's interest for the reasons I mentioned. Another possibility is to give one example where, you know, just simply one, like inflation or socialized medicine or whichever, where people think the moral and the practical diverge and then say no. But even there, you've got a certain pressure if you take a real life example, because then people have to hold that example till you go through the theory and then come back to how your theory resolves it. So you'd have to choose the example well. But if you give across the board from all over the place, example after example of domestic and foreign policy, to make your paper convincing, you have to show that your theory does provide the answer to all these examples. But you can't possibly do that, and you don't even actually try to do it. You simply say, in effect, hypothetically, here is my answer to all of these. Now, these answers don't convince you. Well, if you saw my theory, it would convince you. And then you give a quick shot to the theory and say, well, let's apply it to capitalism, which itself is a gigantic controversial issue. But you can't even begin to undertake the arguments to defend capitalism as a tail-end example of the moral and the practical, so you ask the reader to do it. If you know it's near the end of your paper, you say, this is the kind of thing that the reader should do, but that's the kind of thing the writer should do, you see, to apply his abstraction. In other words, I think that your opening, while the intention is good, is just prohibitive. It undertakes such a massive assignment that the most brilliant writer in the world who knew the theory inside out could not do it plausibly in this space. What I do like about this opening particularly is on page 15, the 5th paragraph. That's very effective. Page 15. If you could get to that without having to write such a long essay about it, if you make the reader experience himself, oh yes, I do believe there's a dichotomy between the moral and the practical, then you have really hooked him. But I think you could get him to grasp that there is this problem right at the outset without having to give him such a lengthy discussion. Now, let us look, first of all, I just want to point out to you on page 15 before we get to this in theory, but look at this sentence in paragraph 6 of page 15. In other words, the moral and the practical are identical. Now, would you actually want to maintain that as a viewpoint? That the moral, in other words, those two terms are identical, or what?
Well, if I had my choice, I would have taken it out after considering it, because
you see that that is unclear, because if those two things are identical, the first question is, well, is one of those terms superfluous? Is it like, just two synonyms? Or why have both concepts? If you're going to discuss the relation of the moral and the practical somewhere or other, you have to indicate, is there a need? Is one of these concepts false? What is the actual connection between them? And to just say right out, the two are identical, just leaves you with a lot of questions that aren't answered. They certainly don't clash with each other, but that they don't clash is not the same as that they're identical. Now, again, I like on the bottom of page 15, your second last paragraphs and your last paragraph, you're showing that people hold that dichotomy in a way that they would recognize. Some would say this is moral but not practical. Some would say it's practical but not moral. Both would agree that there is a dichotomy. So again, I think your intention is good, trying to show them that they do subscribe to this dichotomy, but it's far overdone. It's way more than you can possibly deal with. Now let's get to page 16. Your second paragraph. The view that there is a dichotomy between these two is more widespread than any particular philosophy. Well, I would like to put a certain, at minimum, to say that's a debatable proposition just as content. I doubt that the view that there's a dichotomy is more widespread than any one moral philosophy, because I think the dichotomy essentially derives from one particular moral philosophy, namely which? The basic root in people's minds of the idea of a moral versus practical. Morally, I think, depends on one essential philosophy so overwhelmingly that I think it's misleading to say that the root is more widespread than any one moral philosophy. Which, yes. Yes, I think, well, some form of altruism or self-sacrifice. So long, because that's been really the only ethics dominant, with vague elements of a more Greek pro-egoist ethics occasionally. The real ethics dominant in the last thousands of years where this issue comes up is some form of self-sacrifice, whether to God or society or whichever. That really has been people's idea of what constitutes morality. Now, if you hold that view, then you are necessarily doomed to have a dichotomy, because self-sacrifice is not a way of living on earth, but an attack on everything required to live on earth. It's sacrifice of the mind and independence and wealth and happiness, etc. And therefore, people would necessarily be put in a position, if they hold that code, that what the code requires is one form of existence and what actual life requires is another. That would be actually true. And therefore, insofar as they try to live, they have a fundamental inconsistency built into their viewpoint. There's that which is required to be good and that which is required to live. I don't think there's anything else really that persistently underlies the moral-practical dichotomy but that. And if you notice your examples, both sides of it are examples of this, because the people who think that capitalism in your example is impractical do so because of a warped view of selfishness. They think big companies will run wild and gobble up the consumer, and that idea that they'll raise prices out of the sky and everyone will starve because of the rapacious greed of the capitalists. Well, that is simply an altruist's projection of what would egoism consist of. And of course, the other side that thinks capitalism is immoral explicitly says because of the needy and so on, that there's not enough sacrifice. So both sides, whether they call capitalism impractical or immoral, do so on the grounds that the good is self-sacrifice. And so on your own example, I think that the source is clearly that one moral issue. Now you go into the mind-body dichotomy as the source, and you give a certain history, and you give that fairly reasonably, in effect on a metaphysical level. But there's a question that I have here about explaining it by reference to a metaphysical level at this point in the game. Now, what is the problem? with introducing two worlds and two realities and so on at this stage of the game. We don't yet know what is the correct view on this question. The reader presumably still thinks that it's obvious that there are many cases of things which are moral but not practical and vice versa. You've just given him an example. He'll probably ally himself on one side or the other, so he thinks, yeah, this is very plausible. Obviously, there's a clash between the moral and the practical. I'd like to see how he's going to get out of that one. And then you say, now the source of this is a heavy metaphysical view that goes back to Greece. And that to the reader will not be plausible because he thinks what? He thinks it's right. Who needs a big metaphysical view to explain this? It's right. Obviously the moral and the practical are in conflict with each other. We don't need some kind of Platonic forms or whichever to explain that. Just look around you, you see. And therefore, don't bring in philosophy as an explanation, and this is a general rule, until your reader appreciates the need for an explanation. Now, there was a parallel to this same problem in the paper on the primacy of consciousness, where the introduction quoted Kennedy as being an example of the primacy of consciousness, and then right away said, what causes this? And made it look as though an avowed issue of metaphysics in Kennedy's mind was the cause. And I said at the time it's implausible because people wouldn't see that you need that kind of complex explanation. The same is applicable here. Now, ultimately, if you wanted to explain where does altruism and anti-life ethics come from, you'd have to say it comes from an attack on this world and man's life in this world, which has to rest on some supernatural dimension. Therefore, it does rest on a certain metaphysics, without which, directly or indirectly, you couldn't preach self-sacrifice. There always has to be some kind of supernatural realm. But it isn't clear to people that that would be so, or that that's necessary if they still are at the state where they think this issue is obvious. And consequently, first you have to come in simply, see, and say, you think this issue is so obvious that there's a conflict. I take the opposite view. You don't even need an example. Then you present your view. You make mincemeat of their original view. Then they get to the stage of thinking, gee, I wonder, this is really a fantastic mistake on my part. I wonder where this mistake could have come from. When you've got them wondering, then you say, now if you want to know where you got it, you are in effect the unconscious product of Plato and so on. And then hopefully the reader would be horrified and he'll rush out to deplatonize himself or whichever. But so much of this is an issue of placement, you see. And that's where this is a counter-motivational element on page 16, because you're giving them material that they don't really see that they need if they're an audience who doesn't already understand your view, you see. Now, just one formulation here, and this is on the 5th paragraph of page 16. You say, after they set up the two worlds, they couldn't help noticing that when they followed the spiritual side, their bodies suffered. But instead of changing their moral codes, they turned against, and they declared a dichotomy. Well, you have it not exactly correct there. It wasn't just they got themselves inadvertently into a position and they couldn't help noticing. The main ones actively urged a war against man and this life. So it wasn't just an indirect consequence of their viewpoint. Now we get to the essence of your theory. So let's leave aside your introduction. The essence of your theory here is the bottom third of page 16. Now let's take this as you present it. Practical means something that works to achieve a specific goal. It implies a goal or a standard by which to judge if something works, and that's certainly true. Now let me ask you, how is that related then to the term moral? Moral means something also has to have some standard by which to judge, has to have some goal by which you judge. So I'm back to the question here that I had when you said moral and practical are identical. What is the relation between the term moral and the term practical? Which is a very important thing for you to know in your own mind, even if you don't put it in the paper, if you're discussing the relation of the two concepts, you see. What is the relation, the moral and the practical? You have to know what are the connection of those two concepts. Now, what is your view on that question? You say you hadn't thought of that, but you see why, without that being clear in your mind, you are not clear as to whether morality and practicality are two independent realms, or they happen to coincide, or it's actually two words for the same thing, or one is the cause and one is the effect, or what? Now, actually, if I were to answer that, I'd say the concept practical is much broader than the concept moral. It's much more general than the concept moral, because it simply means that which works or succeeds, that which leads to a desired goal or result. And therefore, you could apply the concept practical in cases where the term moral would not even come up. For instance, the wheel is practical. It doesn't mean the wheel is moral or immoral, obviously, but it's a practical invention. It leads to a certain end. If transportation is the goal, the wheel is a very good means toward that end. So it's a practical invention. On the other hand, a perpetual motion machine, or the attempt to create one, is impractical because it won't lead to the end in question. Or physics is practical, but astrology is not practical. That is to say, if the standard is knowledge and control of the physical world, one leads to the end and the other doesn't. So you're right that practical always is that which works to achieve a specific goal, but it doesn't yet come down to anything so specific necessarily as human action or chosen human action. Now, when you get to morality, you are then talking about what? A specific code to govern human action in those matters which depend upon human choice, right? Now, we have to say some codes of morality would be practical and others would not be. In this sense, some would enable man to achieve his goals and be efficacious, and others would not. Some would be like the wheel and some would be like the perpetual motion machine. And in that, therefore, some code of morality would be practical and some would not. What would be required for a code of morality to be practical? In other words, to enable a man to achieve his values. And in this context, practical means efficacious, successful, able to achieve his goals and values. That's what a practical man is, right? By anybody's theory. A practical man is one able to achieve his values. Now, what kind of code would be required? Moral code, if you're to be able to achieve your values. Suppose you, for instance, you held the code that the primary virtue is prayer. And therefore, if you can hold certain goals like wealth and health and so on, and whenever they're threatened or whenever you want to take action, you should get down on your knees and simply face Ayatollah Khomeini and wait. Now, there's a certain moral code that recommends, hope and prayer and faith as very high virtues, but that is obviously not practical, right? For what reason? That is not the means required in order to achieve human values. What is the means? Certain kind of thought and action, certain kind of use of reason, right? So obviously you could see right away, if you're going to have a moral code which is practical, which enables you to achieve your values, it has to extol as a serious virtue the actual human faculty which enables man to achieve values, which is reason, and then some elaboration of that, thought, independence, so on. What else? Well, suppose you held this kind of moral code. It's okay to think how to achieve values and even to go out and get them, but the instant you get them, you should destroy them. Would that be practical? Or, the more you achieve them, the more you should torture yourself and thereby prevent yourself from enjoying them or achieving any further. You should first want something desperately and then work as hard as you can to get it, and just when you're on the threshold of getting it, you should cut your throat. Now, you would not say that as a practical code by any definition of practical, right? Because if the definition enables you to achieve your values, a code which counsels that you cut your throat as the high virtue, obviously it wrecks practicality. Now, is there such a code? Yes, because the name exactly of that policy is sacrifice, if you know Ms. Rand's elaboration and analysis of the term sacrifice. If you're indifferent to something and you give it up, that's not a sacrifice. But if you burn passionately for it and then you give it up, so you feel the knife turning, that's a sacrifice. Well, that is the actual antithesis of practicality. I mean, you couldn't think of anything more impractical than that, which is the reason why the dominance of altruism and self-sacrifice has led to this dichotomy. And I'm not going to go through the whole of objectivism here, but what I want you to see is practicality is a broader term. And then different codes of ethics would have to establish their credentials with regard to practicality by whether they do or don't advocate those policies that enable man actually to achieve values, you see. Now, what would be the ideal code in this regard with reference to man's ability to achieve his values? Well, you say rational egoism. You're getting there one step too fast. I mean, but first take it just in general. If it advocated all those things which lead consistently to the achievement of values, and it didn't countenance any policies which led volitionally to failure or self-destruction, it would be perfect in this regard, right? So all you have to say is, well, what are those policies that lead consistently? The use of man's means of survival aimed exclusively at the achievement of values for his own sake. And then you've got complete consistent action on principles which will achieve your values. That is practicality. And that is rational egoism, you see. Now, as against any form of anti-reason or anti-selfishness. So I would say, having presented that in principle, the objectivist has to be practical. The objectivist morality. Not all moralities, but the objectivist morality, right? Now, you do, in effect, try to say this on the bottom of page 16, where you say morality is necessary because it's not enough to want to be practical. You have to live a certain way, and morality is the theory behind practicality's practice. Well, if the right context were established, that's okay. In other words, you can look at it as you want to achieve values. Morality tells you what's required. But your discussion here, I don't think, is as convincing as it could be on the bottom of 16. For one main thing, it's too brief. You don't give us, you see, if you would just do, in effect, what I had done, show us why certain principles are necessary by the nature of what practicality is. But since you didn't begin by separating the two concepts, it goes by so fast that it's not too clear. There's another reason why your discussion is not too convincing beside is the brevity. What is really, I think, desperately needed to make this point clear that is omitted on the bottom, on this discussion at the bottom of 16? Anybody? Can you think what type of point would be required to make this theoretical discussion really clear? I've already made it, so it's something I did, and it's a technique which I can't recommend strongly enough. It's really urgent, and that you didn't do it. And what is that? Yes.
Well, I think
Contrast. I can't emphasize that enough. Contrast. If you want to say this theory leads to practicality, it's infinitely clearer if you say as against this type of theory. And then the person can see set out. Oh yeah, if I follow this, that leads there. If I don't, that leads there. And the fact of the difference makes the original thing so much clearer, you see. Now, you had a certain contrast in a generalized way, but by having it precede this and doing it in metaphysical rather than ethical terms, you make it so diffuse that it doesn't really serve that purpose. But do you see the difference, in effect, between what I said in pattern and what you did? Does that clear why yours wouldn't be as convincing as it could otherwise be? Now, I want to just clarify a couple of points on the philosophy here so you won't be confused. When I say objectivism is practical, does that mean that, therefore, any moral man on a given objectivism who follows the objectivist code will therefore necessarily be practical? I said the objectivist morality is the only one that leads to practicality. Does that mean any actual objectivist is necessarily practical if he follows objectivism? In other words, if you go out and subscribe to objectivism, do you get in effect a diploma or certificate saying you are guaranteed practicality hereafter because it simply is the same thing as morality, which is what you said there. Identical concepts. But I want to clarify that because they're not. You can be 100% moral and fail. Now, practicality is a hard question of your existence in reality. Did you get your goals or not? If you don't get them, you did not succeed. You failed. You were not efficacious. You were impractical. Now, what type of thing could make a perfectly moral man, 100% moral, nevertheless fail? I mean, moral by the objectivist theory. He lived up to every virtue, every attitude, and so on, and yet he failed. He didn't achieve his goal. What type of thing? Yes. Well, one thing is errors of knowledge. Morality tells you, in effect, in this regard, use your mind to the fullest, which is your best possible chance of achieving values, but it doesn't guarantee that you're always going to use it correctly. You might make a perfectly innocent error of knowledge, and the result is you fail, and you might fail very badly. There is no God, and you don't get rewarded for having good intentions. It's not as though God is sitting up there and he says, this guy lived up to rationality, so I won't hold his mistake against him. You see, if the bridge is out and you were perfectly rational, but you didn't know it was out, and you drove your car over it, you're going to fall, whether you got there by evasion, by honesty, Now, if Christianity were true, God would pull the car up because you were honest, but that is not true. Objectivism holds the primacy of existence. So it says you should think, because that's the best possible chance of getting over the bridge, but if you make a mistake, that's why you should think, because it's so crucial to arrive at the right answer. But if you make a mistake, you can fail even so. So you have to take that into account. Philosophy is not omnipotent. It does everything that it tells you in all the things possible to you. This is what to do, but a lot may not be possible to you. Beside errors of knowledge, there's what other type of factors that may prevent you, even though you're completely moral. Yes?
Live in a dictatorship.
You could say you could live in a dictatorship, or more broadly, other men. If what you want is a goal that in any way depends on other men, either them leaving you alone or cooperating with you in some way, you can't be guaranteed that, simply because you're virtuous. Take Rourke had an enormous struggle, even in a free country, in the Fountainhead, and if he had died earlier, he would have failed. And then, of course, there's what other type of thing, besides errors of knowledge and besides other people's irrationality? Yes?
A whole list of skills like learning, problem-solving, decision-making, and planning.
Well, all of that learning and problem-solving and so on involves the possibility of error, so it's the same point. But I'm thinking of another whole category of thing which could cause you to fail even though you're completely moral. Yes?
Errors in judging other people.
Well, errors in judging comes under errors more broadly. But I mean, there is, after all, physical nature. There's not just our mind and other people's minds. And you and everybody can be terrific and moral and wonderful, and if you get hit by a meteor, that's it. Earthquakes and plagues and illnesses. Now, morality doesn't do anything about that. It may be true that if you're completely rational, you won't be subjected to psychosomatic ailments and so on, but it still is not a guaranteed protection against physical reality. So the point is nothing can guarantee practical success. All you can ask of an ethics is that within the realm of those things open to your judgment, does it do everything possible to achieve success? If so, it qualifies as practicality, you see. Now, you see, those are not identical concepts. And if you call them identical, you'll have a real temptation to think, well, if I'm moral, I have to be practical because the two are the same. And then the next consequence is you'll be very disappointed because you did your moral thing and it didn't work, you see. So you want to be very careful about that type of thing. There's even a usage in which you could call somebody practical but not moral. Now, that's not an objectivist usage, but it is a usage, which is still another complication. For instance, suppose you took the Fountainhead in the middle of the book, and stopped it in the middle. So Rourke was left at the point where he's in the quarry. And Keating is at one of the top architects and wealthy and has Dominique, and he's got every practical goal he claimed to want. Keating is practical and Rourke is not. So one is a failure and the other is not. Now the point of the Fountainhead is that these concepts apply long range across the whole pattern of a life. But take any short range moment, a criminal might get away with robbing a bank, and a virtuous man might be frustrated and thrown into jail unjustly. So if you apply those terms in a very narrow short range way, there isn't even a parallel between the moral and the practical. Only objectivism would say you should apply that, you should make clear when you're talking about the short range and when you're talking about the long range and the philosophical, you see. I'm just saying this because if you say to people the moral and the practical are identical, you're going to be bombarded with this type of thing, and you should know approximately what type of thing to say. Now, I wouldn't say all of this has to go into your paper, but enough should go in so that we understand what it is about objectivism that entitles it to claim that compatibility with practicality, why it alone is the ethics which is practical, and restrict your claims so you're not implying you're guaranteeing practical success under all circumstances. And to do that, you would have to make it clear, you would have to make the contrast, to an opposing code, as I did. Now, does anybody have any other comments or questions on the actual nub of the paper, the theoretical discussion? Yes?
Don't you think that this would require more of an explanation or validation of why life is the standard of morality? Because a reader who has the premise that there's a conflict between the moral and practical, and who has the wrong moral code, may think that you're just arbitrarily establishing life as the standard of morality, which is by definition practical.
Well, you say, to repeat that, if you hold this dichotomy and don't establish life as the standard of ethics, a reader may think you're just arbitrarily making ability to succeed in your values here on life the practical, so you're in effect assuming life as the standard without arguing. Now, you're right in this regard, but then the paper couldn't be done. If you want a full proof of the correlation of the moral and the practical, to call it that for short, you first have to validate the standard by which you're judging the practical, because practical per se is very, very broad. And theoretically, I say, St. Francis of Assisi, or one of the medieval saints when they were rolling around drinking laundry water, and mortifying the flesh and so on, could say, not that they did, but theoretically they could say, I'm being practical, I'm hard-headed and realistic because my goal is to get into heaven, and in effect for some weird reason God requires this. You see, so I'm just living up to the entrance requirements of this exclusive club. And by that standard, this is very practical, whereas if you make a fortune here on earth, it's impractical because you're simply going to burn forever. Now, they did not actually say that, but theoretically, if you left completely open practical, then you couldn't prove anything about the relation of the moral to the practical, because practical, as Reardon says, depends on what it is you want to practice. But I think in a short paper, he can take for granted that practical for most people, and he can take that for granted here, means the ability to achieve your values here on earth. Now, to achieve your values here on earth is impossible if you don't attempt to live and do the things that success and prosperity here on earth requires. Therefore, I think he doesn't have to, in the context of this kind of paper, establish it. Also because religious people do not normally defend their view by saying that it is practical. They normally say they condemn practicality and they're concerned with the spiritual or the ideal. Yes?
I thought it was the moral part that required defense. In other words, practical is clear, but you're trying to show that your moral standard is in fact
Oh, you say, what I have to, in order to establish the moral part, what I have to show life as a standard? No, all I would have to do is say, if you grant me the practical part is, it's practical if it enables me to achieve my values here on earth. Then I simply have to say, fine, if that's your goal, how does man achieve his values here on earth and what does it require? And then just discuss whatever the values are, so long as they're actually achievable. Because you'll find that the only things that are achievable are the ones that require consistency, and that implies life as the standard. So there is definitely a way of doing it without going into what's called the metaethics of objectivism. Although I grant you, if you want an unanswerable case, someone could say, well, you're assuming a certain view of morality, and I don't grant that that's morality. So then you'd have to do it. Yes?
I'm a little bit confused about this issue of practicality and success. Isn't there a use of practicality, meaning being equipped to achieve your goals, even if you don't achieve them, so that the person who fails can still be completely practical?
Yes, in that sense, you can make a distinction between practical with regard to possessing what you call the equipment or the capacity or the developed abilities to achieve your goals. In other words, you're in tune with reality, you have self-esteem, you have confidence in your own judgment, you have developed intellectual capacity, you know what you want. You're in effect like a mechanism perfected to be able to achieve its goals. And in that sense, you are practical as a potentiality, but I'm simply saying you have to distinguish that from the guarantee that in any given concrete you necessarily are going to succeed with that equipment. But you could say, for instance, if you mean this, Rourke is a practical person and Keating is not. And that is compatible with saying, at any given stage of their life, Rourke has not yet succeeded in achieving his goal and Keating has. Although even there, it's a question of what Keating's goal is, and whether he ever gets whatever he's really after, but I'm staying away from psychology. Yeah, but just existentially, he wanted to be at the top of his profession, he made it. Yeah.
If you don't try to prove that life is the standard and defend life as the standard, how then would you distinguish, say, egoism as developed by Miss Rand and egoism developed, say, by Nietzsche?
Well, that's a very excellent point. The question is, if you don't try to prove life as the standard, but you do go into egoism, how would you distinguish egoism of a kind which is practical, namely rational self-interest, from egoism like a la Nietzsche or whichever, which is not? You're simply giving further fuel to the idea that you actually can't discuss morality completely convincingly without laying down the standard first. There is, however, a way of wording it which excludes the arbitrary and the whim worship and so on, not by coming at it headlong and saying there are 12 theories of egoism and I advocate theory 1 for these reasons, where there's no space, you see, but simply by always saying rational, in accordance with facts, by your best judgment. Those are ways of indicating I distinguish myself from another type of egoism, but I'm not discussing it here. See, there are ways of doing that, but it is tricky. You see that this is a really tricky assignment, so I hope that you don't feel chastened by these comments, but it's really very tricky because you have to discuss morality in a framework where you have no time to establish it in the teeth of a completely opposite view dominating people. Now, I just want to make another comment here, and that is about the last part. When you say, see an example of how the moral and the practical go hand in hand. Now, an example would be a good thing to show how they go hand in hand after the theory. An example would definitely be a good thing, but there's something very wrong with your example, which starts on the 3rd paragraph of page 17 and effectively continues over till the end of the article. Now, what is your example? Now, remember, this is an example. What is the first, or if not the first, at least one essential rule in the use of examples? An example has one overriding function only, and that is what? To concretize, to clarify, to let you grasp in the simplest possible way. Now, the simplest way may not be the most interesting way. It may not be an exciting way, but ideally, you choose your example in such a way that it's intelligible, self-contained, objective, and also, you know, sexy, in the sense of interesting and arouse people and so on. But if you have to choose, supposing you just can't think of an example that combines both, which way do you have to go? You have to go with the more prosaic but intelligible example, because cognition comes before excitement. They have to be able to follow it. Now, if you take, they're struggling with this very broad abstraction, the moral and the practical, and you say, now the example is capitalism. What are the obvious objections to that as a selection of an example? It's such a mammoth subject. It's a much bigger subject. It's the whole field of politics. It's not just one aspect of morality. There are so many confusions on that subject. Everything you say in theory and in practice raises more questions than anything you said about the moral and the practical. On top of which, because it's such a mammoth subject, I kept writing in the margin or asking myself, this page 17 and 18, is this theory or practice? Is this morality or practicality? Now, this is supposed to be an example of practicality, right? Of the practicality of a certain morality, right? This is the bottom of page 17 and all of page 18, the last page. It's supposed to be practicality. But if it's practicality, it is so abstract that it isn't very convincing as practicality. It reads like it's more moral theory. For instance, what conditions do I need to be confident of my success in life? Now, surely that's theory. That's abstract moral theory. How would you distinguish that from the basic question of ethics? What conditions do I need for success in life? That's what ethics asks, right? Could I produce what I need? Can I plan what will happen if I'm not act according to my own judgment, and so on and so on. All of that is very broad abstractions. Now, if a person is not convinced by your most broad abstraction, namely, rationality and egoism is a prerequisite of achieving your values, I doubt that he's going to be convinced on this level, which is just one step less general, you see. But you were forced onto this level because you took such a mammoth subject as an entire, very controversial political system as your example. So you couldn't deal with it, you know, in any concrete way, because that's a whole book. So you had to deal with it in terms of broad abstractions, and so you were left to this position of this confession on the third last paragraph on page 17, which indicated that you sense that there's something wrong here, that the compelling practical importance of the above argument might be easier to grasp if the argument is examined in a less abstract light. Well, that is certainly true. But that is, you know, your mind telling you you must really concretize this and show its connection to practicality as people would use the term practical. But then you realize that you couldn't do it because to discuss the practicality of capitalism in concrete terms is out of the question in this length. So you said the reader should try. So in other words, it amounted to, I can't really show you that the moral is the practical, but I'll give you a few intermediate abstractions and good luck. You work it out. Now, what would be a much better thing if you want to use an example? If you actually want to use an example, you would want to get the most down-to-earth, concrete type of example that you possibly could to tie it right down to something specific. When you argue that something is moral and then say, and besides that it's practical, what do you really convey when you say, besides that it's practical? That it actually works in reality. It leads concretely to certain results, right? So the best thing to do would be to take something, some one government law, for instance, that people argue for, and say, I'm going to show that this is, say, immoral and impractical. Or you could do it positively, but negative would be a good way to do it. And then your whole point would be to show that the impracticality follows from the immorality. And then you would really convince people in a concrete case. Here's an actual case where disobeyed a certain moral principle, and I see why that led to actual disaster. Now, you take the socialized medicine as an example. Now, it works out to be a very good example because you could indicate briefly why is it immoral according to the principles of the ethics that you hold. And you could show it, it involves the use of force and need above ability, etc., and so on. You can do that briefly and then show that the very things which makes you decide that socialized medicine is immoral, doom it to failure in actual reality. That the better doctors desert the system because they can't function under those kind of conditions, and that's a direct consequence of the requirements of the mind. You see, and the fact that this is force, and therefore it's anti-mind. The worst people, the malingerers, etc., suddenly multiply, and there's masses of patients who can't be treated because they no longer have to earn what they get something for nothing. So the injustice manifests itself in a complete impossibility of treating them, etc. And you can show, if you do it, it's a simple example. There are many, many examples of that case, but in one case where the very violation of abstract moral principles dooms it to practical failure, you see. And that becomes very convincing if it's appended to a broader discussion of the moral and the practical. But you see, even one example, and just a sample of it, would take you a page and a half. But capitalism, with everything that involves, you can't do it, you see. That's why I felt, again, the crow reasserting itself at the end, that it just more here than anybody could take in. Now, I have just one last comment just to check your wording, your very last sentence on page 18. In other words, the moral principles and practical conclusions are based on the same premises. Now, what are the premises here?
What I meant was the thing stated on page 17, paragraph 4.
You meant page 17, paragraph 4. And I see that the moral and the practical both make reference to reason as man's means of survival. Well, that's true as far as it goes, but this reference is so remote now, I didn't know what you meant. And you were, in effect, struggling to connect the moral and the practical, but you see, you didn't always word it the same way, which means in your own mind you were not exactly clear on the relationship, because at one point they were identical, and then they were based on the same premises, and then one led to the other. In a case like that, the only thing I can say is that is very normal. That is, I don't think there's one philosophic idea that I did not myself go through exactly that process of development on that. That is, I would try to write it. And in one paragraph it would come out as cause and effect, say the 2 points. In the next paragraph as effect and cause. In the next paragraph the two were the same. In the next paragraph one was a concrete and the other was a broader abstraction. And all I knew is they go together somehow, but I didn't have any clear idea as to how. And then learning was really a painful process of trying to figure out which of all these is correct, what actually is the relationship, and why do I think it's a little bit of this and a little bit of this. And it was more or less agonizing across many, many years, one at a time. And I never found any spillover. That is, if I got two concepts, the relation clear, it never helped on the next two. So it was kind of a lifelong thing. But finally, you get certain basic ones, and then the others become examples. So I don't want in any way for you to feel badly about that confusion, because that is, I think, actually unavoidable in the beginning writing. So I do think there are definitely virtues, particularly your virtues are in your intention of tying it to what people are interested in, and the fact that you did, in one way or another, get the essential point in. But by not really relating the moral and the practical, those concepts exactly, you're left a certain, not contrasting, you're left a certain vagueness, and your overriding problem, what made me put it on the lower end of the estimate, is the motivation and the examples completely violating the Crow epistemology, see, and therefore swamping the reader. So that's what I would say. Thank you. All right, now let us turn to the last paper, Racism by Mr. Thomas Gray. All right, let us begin by preliminary assessment of this paper. How many would say this is essentially positive? I've scared you off from making positive judgments, is that it? There's only a small sprinkling. How many would say mixed? Definitely a majority. And how many would say negative? Well, there's a fair number. In this case, I don't agree with what seems to be the substance of the view. I have a higher view of this paper, as far as I can tell from your hands, than you seem to, because I would put this as good or low good, or certainly very high mixed. It's hard to do these exactly, but I think there's a lot of good things in this paper and a lot of good condensation of complex material. Let me hear first your general reactions. What, if you liked things in this paper, what was good about it? Yes?
Level of abstraction.
Level of abstraction. Elaborate a bit. What do you mean by that?
Well, it did deal with high-level abstractions, more on a concrete level.
You didn't feel that it was floating abstractions, in other words. No, he did at no point degenerate into very empty abstractions. You knew what he was talking about. There were some cases where he didn't use the abstractions exactly correctly. He had a tendency to, condense certain issues which you have to make certain distinctions, but the general level, yes, is all right in that regard. What else? Yes?
You like the energy of it. It's like passionately reasonable.
Yes, I like the quality of that too. You say there was a quality of passionate reasonableness. There was a definite intensity, a sincerity, a conviction to this paper, and it was also intellectual because he discussed the wider issues, he defined his terms, he connected basic issues to moral, to political issues. So it was the union kind of reason and emotion, which I particularly liked. It was definitely a honestly felt and intellectually expressed paper, which I think was good. Yes?
Well integrated with so much of the subject. That's why I felt.
What do you mean by well integrated?
Well, in the thought, and the quality of the thought, understanding, and also with linking it with the emotions.
Well, you're not really saying anything beyond what we said here. Yes?
I like the way he came to grips with the issue. He didn't just slip it by us, but he actually discusses what racism is.
Yes. One of the best things about this is no-nonsense quality to it. Let's start by saying what racism is, and he says unequivocally and very well what racism is. He has a definite structure that you can follow. He tells you what is it. Now the question is this right? An emphatic no, he tells you on page 19. Then what's wrong with it at the root? What does it lead to, etc. And then he goes on to the other aspect, which is collectivism. But he has a definite purpose ruling him throughout. What about the motivation of this paper? The entire motivation is the first paragraph. Is that acceptable or not? Is that good, bad, what? Yes, the back.
I like it because you don't need so many examples.
Right. It's perfectly acceptable. It's adequate. A topic such as racism you do not have to make a song and dance about, because that's obviously an immediate current issue. It's on everybody's knowledge and so on, and therefore it's not that esoteric and academic. The only question I would have, Mr. Gray, about the introduction is that you have a tendency in your wording to make it sound like it's going to be primarily a psychological rather than a philosophical paper. That is, instead of saying the question is, what is it and is it right or wrong, you say why do people hold it and what can we stop them? So it's more, you gear us more to expect a psychological paper, you see, of what's the motives and so on, which you do cover, but actually you cover them briefly at the end, and your main thrust is philosophical. So I think your opening paragraph is slightly misleading in the direction that it points, but that's okay. That's not a major thing. Now we come to your discussion of racism on the bottom of 18, and I think that is very well put. It's in your own words. It's essentially accurate, and I like that conjunction of the mind and the body. The content of his mind is inherited and indicated by an aspect of his body. I think that is implied in any form of racism. Now, a racist may in fact be a materialist. He may deny the man even has a mind, that he holds ideas at all. He may say he simply acts by the blood. But from our perspective, since we accept that there is a mind, he does in fact imply that you have no choice over the mind and that your genetic structure determines its content. So you are stating, in effect, racism not necessarily the way every racist would agree as a definition, but what it actually is from your perspective, and that's perfectly legitimate, and I think is very well done. I particularly like this sentence, which I actually found illuminating. That's one of the main reasons why I'm inclined to give a very high opinion to this paper, because I've read a great deal on philosophy, and I find the first sentence of your last paragraph on page 18 very clarifying, actually. By definition, racism is both a form of determinism and collectivism. Now, I had to stop for a minute and think, is that really true? I knew it was by definition a form of collectivism, but that is by definition a form of determinism stopped me for a minute, because I never thought of that actual connection. But your preceding paragraph really established the context that you have no control over your mind, and then this paragraph explains your mind and so on is all determined by your ancestors, and therefore you really have no choice. And that's really implicit in the doctrine, that you are nothing, you're just a fragment of the group. So I found that a clarifying point, and therefore I'd like to make a big point of praising you for that. I think that's a very economical and intelligent way of making the point. So I'll give very high grades for your analysis of what racism is on the bottom 2 paragraphs of 18. My only question is, I want to be sure you understand something which I'm not entirely sure of later. How do you relate racism to collectivism? Now, here you say it is a form of collectivism, which is correct. But later, you have a tendency to equate it with collectivism. Do you understand that collectivism, how would you relate those two terms, racism and collectivism? Are they equally broad, or are they two terms for the same thing, or what?
Racism is a form of it. Collectivism is a broader.
Collectivism is the broader term. Could you cite me an example of collectivism which is not racism?
Political collectivism, such as.
Well, what do you mean by political collectivism? Because racism has political implications.
Well, communism, for instance. Many communists.
All right, communism would be a form of collectivism which is not racism. Why is it not racism? The communists claim that they do not accept, blood or skin color or any anatomical, physiological criteria. They do divide men into groups, and they say the individual is nothing except a member of the group, and his whole existence is to serve the group. In that sense, they're collectivists, but the preeminent group is not a racially defined group. For communism, it is a economically defined group, right? It is proletariat. Now, you could argue, you could make a case, and in fact, I think it's true, that every collectivist ultimately will end up as a racist. I don't think it's an accident that, for instance, anti-Semitism is so strong in Russia, that racist feeling is growing in Britain as they get more and more socialistic and so on. So I think you can make a case that racist doctrines will start to proliferate when collectivism of any kind takes place in a society, but it doesn't mean that the two doctrines are synonymous. Technically and philosophically, racism is one form of collectivism. The reason, of course, that racism would what would be the reason, this has been covered by Ms. Rand, why racism would begin to develop wherever collectivism of any kind takes place? What's the logic of the reason for that she explains? Yes, Mr. Coase.
I don't remember what she explained, but perhaps would it be that it's the most obvious difference that can be picked up?
It's the most primitive form of collectivism. If you tell men they have to huddle in a group that they're nothing, then on that mentality, what Ms. Rand calls a perceptual level mentality, which is what collectivism appeals to, the worldwide proletariat is infinitely too big an abstraction and has no reality to them, so they're going to huddle into the group that is the folks next door who is exactly like them, and they're going to be hostile to all so-called outsiders or aliens. So it's not an accident that racism coexists with collectivism, but technically they're not the same. And I want to be sure you understand that. Now, how do you relate the term tribalism to collectivism? Now, I don't mean to make this a linguistic course, but when you start writing, you have to know your key terms, how they're interconnected. Is tribalism synonymous with collectivism?
Not synonymous.
Good.
It's a collectivism is a broader term.
Collectivism is broader, but tribalism is more narrow. Well, is tribalism synonymous with racism?
No. No.
What is the difference then between the two? I just want to know whether you are clear on this point. You're right. But what is the difference? All tribes are racial. A tribe is, a certain group in a certain, if you take it in the literal sense, it's a group in a given geographic area with the same kind of the same kind of race. So the two are similar. The two terms are similar in that respect. But we can use tribalism more broadly than racism for a certain kind of mental attitude of belonging to the group and ignoring your own individuality, of facing your own individuality and merging with others without that necessarily implying specifically racism. Yes?
Usually when I use the word racism, racism has a negative connotation. The racist is viewed negatively. I view it negatively.
Oh, certainly, yes.
Yet the tribalist is a member of a tribe.
Well, you say, in effect, racism implies a negative estimate and tribalism doesn't necessarily. Well, that's very debatable because, for instance, if you're Hitler, racism has a positive connotation, so it depends on your philosophy. But in general, tribalism is regarded as a negative term. In the West, where individualism is still supposed to be good, people don't like to be told that their viewpoint is tribalism. Tribalism is really a kind of primitive pre-philosophic phenomenon. It's simply the phenomenon of a person merging into the group around him without intellectual justification, simply because they're there. They're the folks around him, they're what he knows, and who is he to assert himself or question? Now, collectivism is kind of the philosophic term. When that mentality enters the scene of philosophy and says, what is real and what isn't, what is important and what isn't, how should man live, and transcribes it into an abstract viewpoint, that's what we call collectivism. So the two are definitely related, but collectivism is the more abstract philosophic term. Yes?
You say racism has a negative connotation, but...
It certainly does to me, racism,
right,
yes.
What about when somebody ascribes positive value to someone merely because of their skin color or sex or something like that?
Well, they're also engaging in racism, too. Whether you judge a person positively or negatively, if you judge him only by race, that is racist. Whether you say the Jews are inferior or the Aryans are superior by strictly blood and race, that's racist either way. Now, the only question I have on this paragraph is, on the last paragraph on page 18, it is not always wrong to use some of these expressions if the context is available for you. For instance, the Asian mind. Now, if you use that in a racial way, to imply that it's an innate endowment caused by their ancestors, that's obviously wrong. But there are many contexts in which you can talk about the Western mind versus the Oriental mind, in which you mean the dominant ideas pervading the culture. And you recognize that those are volitionally chosen or not racially motivated. So you can't assume that every one of these expressions in every context exemplifies racism. You understand that?
I understand.
Yes.
I meant it in
You mean when it's used in a racist way?
Right.
All right. Now we go over to page 19. And the top paragraph there, you're correct when they say he's guilty by birth is racist, but on the same token, what was just asked is also applicable. If he's superior by racial birth, that's equally racist. So it can work positively or negatively. Now, you have not yet, we're in the second paragraph on page 19, you haven't yet explained what you mean by collectivism. And you say here now, is he the collectivized product of his ancestors? Paragraph 2, page 19. What exactly do you mean by collectivized or by collectivism now? Give me a definition which you know or actually give me. What does collectivism say? You imply it, but you don't state it. I just want to be sure you know.
Collectivism means...
I know that's mean to ask out of the blue for a philosophic definition. I know, but I'm just simply saying in your own mind you should be clear. In essence, which branch of philosophy does collectivism come from? Put it that way. In essence. Now, you can make a case, and I'm sure someone here will be eager to tell me, that in my past lectures I've said there's a collectivist view in every branch, and that's true. But in terms of the fundamental use of the term, where it's not simply a synonym for some other term that already exists, what is of the four big branches of philosophy, what branch does it primarily belong to? Politics, or if you want morality-politics, it's essentially the view that the group comes above the individual, is more important, is more valuable than the individual, and the individual should therefore live to serve the group. That is the essence of collectivism. Now, it rests on a certain view of the mind, which is metaphysics, and a certain view of reality, and it rests obviously on the ethics of sacrifice, but it's specifically sacrifice with the group as the beneficiary, and that should be the guide to how you organize society. Should organize society according to the idea that a given type of group is a supreme value, its representatives should be all-powerful, its will should have no limits, and every individual is simply a means to it. Now, if you understand that, you'll see that when you say, is he the collective product of his ancestors, you're not using it in its literal primary sense, because primarily it's a moral or political evaluative term, you see. And you're actually using this here in a metaphysical sense, if I understand you. That is he, in effect, nothing but a fragment of the group? You're using it in terms of what is he, whereas the essence of collectivism, including racism, which is one of its essential forms, is an evaluative issue. So there's a slight imprecision there. In any event, you would have been a little better advised if you know that determinism and collectivism are the two areas that you're really going to hit to define each explicitly, because it's not that long and it keeps you on the track, you see. Philosophic terms are very slippery. And all the branches of philosophy are interconnected, and all the issues of philosophy are interconnected. And therefore, in the right context, you can use anything just about anywhere. Now, that, of course, isn't true. I take that back. But you have to be careful that the words don't get away from you. And therefore, I like to hammer down the guidelines in advance. And if my theme is determinism, collectivism are the big 2 points in this topic, then I want to define each, at least in my own mind, and be sure I make that clear to the reader. Now, in paragraph 3, you're giving your answer to the determinist one, right? But by introducing it as the collectivized one, also I was slightly thrown off because I never found the answer directly to the collectivist one. You didn't keep your points exactly separated. But now let's assume you're just discussing determinism. Now, you have a very difficult assignment in paragraph 3 of page 19, which is you have to briefly make plausible that thinking is volitional, that determinism isn't true. And that is very hard to do. It's hard to do because it's either common sense or it's wildly controversial. Either you, in effect, throw away man has free choice, take it as obvious, Or you say, you know, you go into the whole song and dance. There have been all these determinists, but they're wrong, and so on. Now, you tried a middle ground, and I think you came very close to getting away with it in what is a very difficult assignment. You tried to go into the idea that thought is conceptual, and if so, you can't say that knowledge is innate. How many reading this would think this would be clear to someone who does not know the objectivist theory of concepts and so on in advance? I'm of a slightly divided mind here. I'm trying to project. I think I would follow this if I didn't already know, but I'm not 100% sure. I'd be curious to get somebody else's impression. Can you read this paragraph as though you did not know the objectivist theory of thought, concepts, and free will, and you simply read, man's nature is that his perceptions of existence be integrated into concepts. They're the basis of knowledge. Thinking is volitional. It's very fast, that's all I can say. I think I could get each point approximately, but it's very condensed. And you might say, well, you want to give some indication of why you say determinism is wrong. The way I would do it is by, at this point, bringing in the term automatic, which is something most people recognize. In other words, if you're going to try this, which is very tricky wording, but suppose you're going to try it in this brevity, I would say something like, his nature is his ability to reason. That involves the use of concepts. I would stay away from terms like integrating his perceptions because it's heavy terms and it scares people. They don't know what do you mean integrating percepts. That's a very technical term, you see. And you don't need it. You need it to give the full case, but you can't give the full case anyway. So I would just try and say something like the ability to reason is the essence. That involves the use of concepts. Obviously, concepts aren't automatic. They don't just pop into our minds without effort. We have to work. It takes choice. I say something like that. You see, I keep your same intention of hanging free will, tying it to the conceptual nature of man, which is really the philosophic issue, but do it a little more simply and commonsensically and not rely so much on terms that might either scare off or baffle the reader. But this is a very difficult thing, and within the framework of what you could do, you did quite well. Now, however, when you get to a man's character is self-made and it's independent of his forefathers, you raise a big problem. What is the question? That's true. That's certainly true. But that is, even suppose the person is with you in that paragraph and they say, okay, thinking is volitional. You have to choose. Your mind is self-determined. You now go to man's character. And now what is the problem that raises? Character is not the same as mind. If you said a man's mind is self-made, that would have been fine. You could go on from there. There'd be no problem. What's the problem with the character? Yes. Well, why? You say people say society determines your character, but what does character as a term involve over and above simply your mental processes, your thinking? Your actions, and above all your emotions, your desires, your feelings, what you want, what you don't want. Now, it's very difficult in a context such as today to get people to see in a brief space like this that the actual way they act and feel is determined by their thought, because that raises the whole question of reason and emotion. And you don't really need it here, because if you simply stuck to your mind is self-made, you'll leave character to implication. You see, the term mind will carry your audience to thinking, well, this guy runs his own life, you see. And only when they finish the paper, they'll think he didn't discuss character, and you say, okay, you can come back for my next paper for that one. But by raising it here, people will begin to think, oh, well, he never said anything about character. Now, then your last sentence, how do you get to has certain rights by nature? How does it follow that man has certain rights from the fact that determinism is false? Now that is a non sequitur. How do you get that? Let's suppose I agree with you. Man has free will. He's self-made. Let's grant all that. He's independent. How does it get that he therefore has certain fundamental rights? All kinds of people believe that without believing in rights. What's the connection? Is it because he has free will that he has rights, or because of something more basic?
Well, in order for his will to be free.
No, you say in order for his will to be free, he needs rights. That isn't true. If you have free will, you have it in Soviet Russia.
In order for him to exercise his free will, he has
Well, in order to exercise his free will in physical action, he needs rights. Is that all you mean?
no, I also have to say that if you attempt to force him
Yes.
to do his will, that you cannot force him.
Why can't you say you have to say you can't force him? Why not? That's simply thwart his will. Why shouldn't you thwart his will?
To kill him.
Well, why will you? You say because you'll kill him. Why will you kill him if you simply tell him you can't exercise your will, you can't think? You see, there's a tie there, and if you this sentence reveals that you're not clear on a certain connection, which comes out explicitly in 2 paragraphs. I may as well point it out here. What is the reason why free will is such an important issue, and we have to have rights and everything? You're one step away from the actual foundation. Yes. Which is, you say man's means of survival. Which is free will?
No.
Which is? The mind is his means of survival. The importance of free will is simply to validate the mind. The importance of free will is to say you really do have a mind and you have to exercise it. If determinism were true, it would amount to the negation of the mind. It would mean, we're just like animals. We just sit there. We don't have to think. We have no choices, etc. We're a non-conceptual species. So free will versus determinism is like a skirmish on the side. You are one step down. The main fight is reason versus anti-reason. Now there's a dozen different ways of annihilating or undercutting reason. One is, for instance, to say, yeah, man has free will. He's completely free, but since his senses are completely invalid, his reason is worthless, so he can do whatever he wants with his free will. And we can do whatever we want with him. You see, we can use our free will to mash his free will. And what's the difference? There's many ways to be anti-reason. You have to keep your eye on the main site here. The main point is man is a rational being. Determinism is an assault on that, and therefore you have to fight for free will. But the reason man requires rights is not simply because he's free, it's because he's a conceptual being who has to think in order to survive, you see. And by tying it to determinism, you make it per se not defensible. You see your priorities are not entirely straight, and you'll see that comes out a little later. Now, one other point here, you have a certain conjunction which confuses 2 different things. In this paragraph 3, you say man has certain fundamental rights, life, property, and to be judged on the basis of his own actions. Now that is a mixture of morality and politics. 2 of those rights can be in a constitution, are political, namely life and property, because they simply mean you have the right to act a certain way, and other people have to leave you alone. You can't have a political right to be judged by others as an individual. You see, you can't have a political right to other people's thoughts. They have a right to be irrational, a political right. Where do their rights stop? When they try to initiate force against you or against anyone else, when they try to legislate or compel other people to agree with them. But you have to make very clear that the only rights you can have are rights to action and to the products of your action. You never have a right to other people's thought. Now, you can say morally, if a guy views me simply as a racial manifestation, I think that's evil, and I think he's evil. That's a different question. You could say he has no right to do it in the same way as he has no right to lie, or he has no right to drink his brains out, or he has no right to countless forms of irrationality, morally. But politically, he has a right, you see. So you can't mix those 2 things together. Now, the next paragraph is very good. That's on determinism being anti-reason. And I think that's very good, with only this question at the very end is a little dubious wording that it's worse than irrational, it's immoral. Why is immoral worse than irrational? because immoral, according to objectivism, is a form of being irrational. So it can't be worse than. The reason that morality is desirable is because it's dictated by reason, so the supreme of those two concepts is rationality, not morality. Rationality determines morality, you see. So it's just, that's a little hyperbolic there. Now, your next paragraph indicates the problem that I mentioned before. You mention these examples, and then you say, will these events ever stop happening? Can the doctrines of determinism be defeated? And there you definitely imply explicitly that the big issue is determinism. That is not the only issue, and that is not even the fundamental issue underlying racism. That's one. But you yourself said there are two. You said it's a form of determinism and of collectivism, and the whole thing is in that combination. Now, I just indicated in what way determinism, or you indicated in what way determinism is anti-reason. In what way is collectivism versus individualism? How is that issue related to reason? Now, that's not the same as determinism. It's related, but a different issue.
Collectivism subjugates the individual completely to the society at large.
You say collectivism subjugates the individual to society. Which aspect, though, basically of the individual does it subjugate? His mind. It tells him, in effect, your mind is nothing. Its exercise is unimportant. You belong to the state, and you should do only what others tell you to do. So, in effect, stifle your mind is its advice, you see, in the name of a superior value. As against individualism would say, the crucial thing is that you have to exist as an individual. Why? Because you exist by your mind, and the mind is an attribute of the individual, you see. So collectivism versus individualism reduces back also by several steps to reason versus anti-reason. So both determinism and collectivism are manifestations in different branches of philosophy of the same root issue, which is reason versus unreason, you see. And therefore, by concentrating it all on determinism, you're, instead of going to the root of what leads to racism and what explains both of the elements, you're doing just a partial analysis, you see. So it's not wrong as far as you go, but you missed the overall thing which would tie it together. All right, let's just turn over now to page 20. Now, on paragraph 3 on page 20, what is the state? You ended, and then paragraph 3, you say, it's the same thing as discussed before, the race, the tribe, only now clothed in the trappings of government. Now, there you are definitely implying what? And your wording. All statists are racists, you see, which you said earlier you didn't believe, but here you have a tendency, you see, to equate racism with collectivism and statism, which is not correct, as we've said. Now, on page 20, the same page, paragraph 5, you're right that collectivism negates the source and purpose of rights, but it negates it not because it's determinism. It negates it for the reason that I mentioned. Namely what? Because it's anti-mind, right. So your connection here between collectivism and determinism, the real way I would look at that connection is like this. Determinism says your mind is nothing. And collectivism then comes in effect, and says, well, if so, don't try to live by it, adapt to what's around you. Let others rule you, you see. Now that's sort of oversimplified because there's many other doctrines. But I just want you to not to think everything comes from determinism, you see, because there's a deeper issue. And that, for instance, what your third last paragraph on page 20. Statism then is just another deadly variation of determinism. Now there you are most explicitly making this mistake. Statist can be an advocate of free will, completely. Statism comes out of politics. What branch of philosophy does determinism come out of? It's basically epistemology, how the mind operates. And it says the mind has no choice. So it's not possible for a political view to be a variant or a variation of an epistemological view. The most it could be as a consequence. And as I'm saying, the major issue is it's not even necessary to be a determinist. Who could make up a philosophy or an example and pattern of how you could believe in free will and nevertheless be a complete statist? Oh, it's all over the history of philosophy. Yes?
Existentialism.
Existentialism. Elaborate.
Because they hold that free will gives no control over life, and therefore it is irrelevant to the issue of...
Right. They say that the existentialists, or at least in some of their moods, say that man has free will, but the universe is unintelligible and existence is absurd and so on. So there's no way to know what to do with your free will, and therefore life is hell, and you're doomed to fear and trembling and nausea, dread, and etc. and so on. And therefore the ideal thing to do is throw yourself at the feet of Fidel Castro or, Genet or whatever. So, I mean, they're certainly classified as advocates of free will, but they're violently anti-mind. And by the same consequence, therefore, they end up as being statists, or Heidegger was a Nazi. So it's back to what is the basic issue, you see. Now, you're right, you'd have to include determinism to capture racism. But then to analyze it, always go back to your fundamentals. Now, I wanted to comment on one other thing. Paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, page 20. Since determinism dispenses with the significance of the mind, and since there's no such thing as innate knowledge, collectivism is left with nothing but whim, wish, and mysticism upon which to base a government. Well, I agree with that. Would that be objective, is the question. Let's say Marxism, for instance. Now, they certainly are collectivists. They are determinists, and they not only dispense with the significance of the mind, by implication, they say openly there is no mind. The mind is a bourgeois superstition. And they certainly don't believe in innate knowledge, so they concede, they grant you all the first part of your sentence. And then they say, we certainly don't say government is based on a whim, wish, and mysticism. Marxists say we're based on science. This is scientific socialism. We're based on the laws of the dialectic process. This is, historically inevitable, granted the trend of history. We're materialists. In other words, what is the point here? You are presenting there your view on a question, which you haven't yet shown is the only possible view on this question, and therefore the collectivists will say you're completely distorting my view. You see what I mean? You haven't tried to even cover that type of thing, and you couldn't in this paper. If you want to get from determinism, or rather, if you want to get from collectivism to what? The idea that government is arbitrary? Is that what you're trying to get to? You're trying to show that collectivism leads to what?
Dictatorship, arbitrary.
Leads to the arbitrary dictatorship. How will you establish that? What would be a simple way to say collectivism, which has to extol the group above the individual, has to lead to arbitrary dictatorship? You want to show that collectivism by its nature has to lead to dictatorship in which the ruler is arbitrary, wanton. How are you going to do that briefly? Well, what do you know about collectivism? It denies individual rights, right? And you know, if you know philosophy and you know your own philosophy, rights are an expression of man's reason, right? Therefore, collectivism denies rights, right? And so it denies reason. It has to deal with men by what means? By force, right? Well, then as soon as if you just say that simply, you see, if collectivism denies rights, it means it doesn't have to deal with men by persuasion, but by force, by compulsion. It can override anybody's mind according to the whim of the ruler. That's all you have to say, you see. In other words, I'm just trying to indicate to you, try to put these things in a self-contained way so you don't bring in other aspects of your view which you don't have time to discuss. And I grant you that's very hard to do. It takes a long time, And the only way you get to that stage is you write something you think is really clear, and you show it to somebody who doesn't agree with you, and he says, that doesn't follow. And finally, you get to automatize what kind of things will be clear and what won't. Now, there's one other thing I want to comment on here, and that is on page 21. No, excuse me, it's not. It's on page 20. Is the third last paragraph. When the moral leaders of today call for sacrifice to the state, to any group or anyone, they are in effect calling for racism. That is why racism still continues. That is too simple a statement, because that rests on your equation of statism with racism. Now, actually, you could make a case that sacrifice would lead to racism, but you can't do it as simply as this. You'd have to show that sacrifice leads to collectivism. And collectivism, by the mechanism we discussed at the beginning, will engender racism, you see. So this is an oversimplified statement. You could say that sacrifice prepares the ground in which racism develops. But the basic thing which engenders it is anti-reason. That's what leads to sacrifice, determinism, collectivism, the works, you see. All right, now, the only last thing I have is this. How did you get the ending? Why did you stick that ending on government? Is that just a sort of a gratuitous plug for capitalism, or did you think that was needed by the logic of your presentation? The last paragraph on page 21.
No, you talked about the last sentence.
You raise a lot of issues there that are hard to establish, but above all, even if it were clear, it's unclear why you go into this at this point, unless it's that you just can't resist, you know, the chance to...
I'll take that, right?
Yeah, but... yeah, well, I can certainly sympathize with that, but it would be a more logical presentation to conclude on some note relating to racism, since that's your overall theme, or something about then the best way, if you have to get in capitalism, you have to end on some note like the only way to combat racism is the system based on reason, namely capitalism. For details, see my next book, you know, whichever. In any event, I think that there was a lot of very good things in that paper, so you see the reason for my overall positive estimate. The main problem there is really thinking, not exposition. It's simply the difficulty of dealing with so many different philosophic concepts and trying to see which is cause and which is effect, and one is concrete and one is abstract. And that's the same type of problem with the moral and the practical paper in that regard, and that's something only a lot of experience and painstaking working with one concept till you get it a little clearer, and then another, and after a while it comes to you. So thank you for your contribution. Now that concludes the papers. I want to just make one tail end, more or less summarizing comment about the course as a whole, which is a fervent hope that this has not been harmful in the following regard. I mean, this whole course. I heard several comments which made me uneasy, and it's for that reason I want to end on this note, about, they were offered sometimes in the form of compliments to me, but they made me uneasy because they were in the form of, in effect, gee, I missed all those errors in that paper, and philosophy is so complicated, and there's so many ways you can go wrong, and if you end up with the impression that philosophy is like a landmine, a field full of mines, and there's a disaster lurking in every word, the net effect is obviously useless, because instead of you going into communication, you'll just retire altogether. So I like at the end to try to efface that impression by simply saying that in principle, philosophic communication is the same as any skill whatever. In principle, it's just like typing or learning French or whatever you have. Obviously, the instructor knows more. If he doesn't, the whole thing is a fraud. And presumably he does because he's been in the field a long time. Certain things become automatized and obvious to him, which wouldn't be obvious to someone who was learning. But you can't possibly take the blame for that, and I hope nothing in my manner suggested that any of these things are obvious. Philosophy is difficult, and it's completely natural that you find at the beginning there's an awful lot of things you hadn't thought about. In any field, I think you will have the experience when you first hear the principles, oh, there's so much here, it's just a mass of stuff thrown at you and you haven't digested it, and there's a certain momentary discouragement of it's just too much to cope with. But what you have to do is decide you're going to just do it a little at a time, a bit at a time, as much as you can digest, and you apply it until something is clear, and then you take a bit more, and so on. That applies just as well to philosophy. So I want to avoid this course having a paralyzing effect that before you go to do anything, you feel there's 12 major things you have to follow, and you simply won't be able to get a word out on paper or orally. I also would very much like to avoid the idea that you are projecting, I'm standing there over your shoulder, and what horrible things would I find if I read what you wrote. Believe me, I have done that to professors or teachers of mine, and it's really an undesirable state, and I ended up really resenting the professors, and you finally have to simply banish them altogether. So the best advice that I could give to you would be this. In action, when you actually sit down to write or stand up to speak or engage in argument, you should thoroughly forget this course. No, I mean that. You should, and I mean this not just as therapy, but as truth because of the Crow epistemology. You cannot undertake the impossible. You have to work with what you have. And when you're in action, speaking or writing or whichever, is not the time to retrain yourself or whichever. That's like you're in midstream, you got to go with what you've got. And in that case, you have to take the attitude. I am omniscient. I am infallible. I'm the master of this subject. There's no one in history who ever equaled me. The hell with Peikoff or anybody else. Then when it's over, you can objectively decide, is there a way I could improve it, edit it, is there something I learned that I could apply now in retrospect and do something different the next time? But that you have to keep the performance and the evaluation separate, otherwise you will be paralyzed. I would like the net effect that you should feel that communicating philosophy can be an enjoyable experience, and above all can be an experience in self-assertion, not in dutifully following or traumatically following dozens of principles, which is impossible to do. So with that qualification, if you can take it that way, I'm happy to have given the course, and I particularly want to thank the people who contributed, who subjected themselves to this trauma in any one of the various forms for helping to make it the success. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Thank you very much. Thank you. I have a number of written questions, so I'll start with those. This first one I never had thought of. It's a suggestion for a different type of small seminar, and the questioner asked me to read it aloud, which it's actually an interesting idea, so I'll read the question. I would like to suggest a title or direction for a seminar-type course, which would be of great value, I believe, for students of objectivism. I might just clarify for people listening to this on tape by the third. I mean, I suggested two that I didn't put on tape because they would be small seminars in New York, one on grammar and one a more advanced discussion of communication. But this is a third suggestion. The title might be Topics in Objectivist Theory, or along this line. This could be made up of 20 or so students who have already studied objectivism. The syllabus would be outlined in the first class when specific questions or problems would be proposed by the students and argued upon for purposes, and agreed upon for purposes of discussion. Such a format would permit a deeper discussion and questions than was possible in a general course. I, for one, would be very interested in this type of course, and if my suspicions are correct, others would be as well. Also, such a course would be, I hope, more interesting to you than grammar, which is not very philosophical to say the least. Perhaps you could read this suggestion to the class. Well, I like grammar. In principle, it certainly would be of interest to me. It never occurred to me as a, well, you say topics in objectivist theory. In other words, just take specific subjects without any particular order, and any given evening have a roundtable discussion or somebody presenting a view on it. I'd have to have it a little more specific what the format would be. I had a strong aversion to, from my own experience at college, to just coming in and paying money when the instructor just sits there and says, and now, Miss Smith, what do you feel, and so on all the way around. So that I believe there has to be some kind of structure and some kind of content if you're actually taking money from people. But in theory, this would be possible. So let me consider this as a possibility. And if anybody is interested, you might just come up and mention it to me at the end, and I'll just see if there is a general interest in that type of thing. Now, questions. Do ideas determine men's values, or do men's values determine men's ideas? Or are ideas and values reciprocal? Well, actually, value judgments are a type of idea. If you say independence is good, or life is good, or murder is evil, those are ideas. They are evaluative ideas. So you couldn't, in that kind of way, make values the source of ideas or vice versa, because they're all ideas. The only thing you could ask is, do certain ideas depend on other more basic ideas? Do values come from more basic ideas, or are value ideas the more basic? And there, of course, the objectivist view is metaphysics and epistemology is the most basic. Value judgments, in fact, directly or indirectly, always derive from a certain view of the world and of the mind, whether the person knows it or not. So value judgments are in no one's mind a primary. If you made them a primary, then objectivity would be impossible, because what would your values be based on? What would your judgments be based on if they were a primary? Primaries have to be self-evident, and values can't be self-evident, you see. And therefore, if you make values a primary, you're committed to, you would be led to be pragmatists, because then the idea would be, well, I don't know why, I want certain things, that's my base, and now the question is what's required to get there. What is the word to use? This question is by the author of the last paper. What is the word to use to express the healthy and positive social connotations, what I thought was termed tribalism? For example, the bond-linking Yankee fans, or fraternity members, professional groups, the AMA, American Bar Association, etc. And he said this type of so-called tribalism is best described as what? It's not racism. Well, I would certainly not call that tribalism. I don't know one word. Friendship, professional camaraderie, fraternity, who can think of, I don't know, one word. Yes?
Association?
Well, association is just a fact, but he wants the positive connotations of, what they call friendship. Yes? Affinity as possible. I don't know that there's any one word. It would depend on the context. Yes?
Well, contrasting it when you say in a tribal sense you're American, that's patriotism. That's a positive answer.
Oh, patriotism is positive, but that's not a tribal. That has nothing to do with it.
On a social scale, is there a word or a concept that addresses?
I don't know it. I don't know a single word that has a positive connotation in all contexts to stand for the spirit of, in effect, friendship and so on. It would be camaraderie or something of that sort. But in any event, I don't know it. You'd look it up in the thesaurus or in the Oxford Dictionary. What are the steps you use in, like this, I actually can't read this word. Oh, dissecting, I guess. In dissecting the oral and written examples in this course, do you start with an outline of an effective presentation on the subject in question, or with a checklist of principles of communication, or both? And there's another question exactly like that, omitting the complement which precedes it. It says, next time you give this course, would you spend some time explicitly teaching how to critique? For example, in critiquing written papers, do you have to find the theme first? Is there a more or less ordered checklist of things to look at? Should you extract the outline? Should you do some of the same things you would do if you were writing the paper, such as listing relevant topics and eliminating the less essential ones? So both of these want me, in effect, to analyze. How do I analyze? Well, I actually do it as follows. Basically, not by a checklist or by any of these steps, but by, would I do it that way, and if not, why not? That is basically the operative question. Would I say this, and if not, why? And I'd try to distinguish what would be an optional personal preference and what I think would be misleading. Now, I would know, though, on any of those topics, since I know the theme in advance, what I consider to be the minimum essential. I mean, after all, the moral and the practical, or racism, or primacy of consciousness, or romantic art, that's, the stuff that I teach or write about on a daily basis. So for any one of those, at a certain point, you get to the stage where if you just press the button, right away that leaps into your mind, there's three crucial things you have to say and one confusion you have to watch out for, and that becomes automatized after a while. So you know in reading a paper, you have that internal standard to look against, and you see, oh, he didn't say point X, and that right away clues you in. Then it becomes a question of, well, how did he get away without saying it? What did he do instead? And then I might have to stop and pause and say, well, he made too much of a fuss about determinism. Oh, I see what he did. He made that the fundamental instead of reason, or something like that. The main thing I would start with is, what would I do given my understanding of what's required for this subject? And how does it depart from that? The only time I used a checklist was on the oral ones, the oral presentations. And I used a checklist there because it was happening so fast, I was afraid I wouldn't remember. See, at home, I read each of these, I would say 3 times slowly on 3 different occasions. Once, just to get the overall impression, although I read it very slowly the first time. And I just put marks in the margin if I had questions or I thought something was omitted. Then I let it set for a couple of days and then read it again slowly and see if I stopped at the same points, and I'd get more clear what is the trouble. And then one more time, I actually read it this afternoon, one more time, to see if any last thing connected, and some criticisms that I was going to make, I thought, well, they're really too minor, and other ones connected, so I see something in common between 2 criticisms that first struck me as 2 separate ones. I don't think you can critique philosophic papers on one hearing. It's too abstract, it's too difficult. You have to read it over and over and over till you get to the stage where you more or less know exactly what is the content of each paragraph. And you can remember when you get to paragraph 3, paragraph 8 is going to say such and such. Oh, now I see why he says this in 3. But in the first reading, you can't do that, no matter how well written they are. So that's my main answer. But I use a checklist, as I say, in the oral, because it happens too fast. I ideally would like them to give the same talk over and over and over, but students will not cooperate with that. So I just simply mark as it occurs to me what particular flaws, and now it's to take this more specifically. Do you start with an outline of an effective presentation? Well, not with an outline, but I start with a knowledge. If I didn't know what I regarded as the proper essentials, I would be completely swimming to know how to evaluate. So first I have to get clear on the subject in my own mind and what it requires. Do you find the theme first? Well, you certainly would have to if you didn't know. I happen to know in all these cases because we discussed the theme in advance. So I came to it with that knowledge. Should you extract the outline? Only in a generalized way. Only if in reading it, you find you simply can't see where the person is going or why. You're constantly lost. I would stop then and say, well, there's something wrong with the organization here. But normally I wouldn't say, what's his outline? I'd assume there is some coherence and let it speak for itself. Should you do some of the same things you would do if you were writing the paper? Yeah, know the subject. That's the crucial thing, because then you can separate out what's required by the subject from problems in the presentation. Now here's one that was left from last week. This question is a little funny, but I will try to formulate it as best I can. What is the thing which animates man? What religion calls soul? I understand how soul cannot exist without body, but if someone says that the soul has energy to animate the body, why can't it be possible that the mind could develop to the point where it could animate outside objects? I suppose this is psychic phenomena, but what is wrong here I can't identify. Soul, what religion calls soul, is an undefinable non-material entity, fundamentally in opposition to this world. So that's a mystical phenomenon. That is out strictly on grounds that mysticism is out. But if you say, what is the thing which animates man, and you don't equate that with religion, the original term that is translated soul was the Greek that meant, that we translate soul, psyche, which means the principle of life. And therefore, it's that, whichever it is, that makes a thing alive. Now, that doesn't say what it is, and as such, in that use, it's a perfectly natural thing. Aristotle, for instance, thought it was a certain kind of structure. Other Greek philosophers thought it was a certain kind of element. Actually, it's not a philosophic question. If you mean by soul simply the principle of life, that, whichever it is, which makes a living thing living, that's a biological question, as long as they don't give a mystical answer. Philosophy has no way to answer that. That's a question of the special science. But where philosophy comes in is when you say, why can't it be possible? First, the mind is not synonymous in this sense with the soul, because not all living things have minds. Carrots are alive, and in the Greek sense they had a soul, but not in the sense that they were alive. They had a principle of life, but they don't have minds. But now the question says, why can't it be possible that the mind could develop to the point where it could animate outside objects? By outside objects, you mean what? Inanimate objects, I assume. Why can't it be possible is not a legitimate question. The onus of proof is on he who asserts that something is possible. You cannot say, by everything we know, in the sum of our knowledge, this type of phenomenon, soul, for instance, exists only as the principle of living things. There's no evidence of any other kind. There's a fundamental difference between living and non-living. How do you know tomorrow, or why can't it be possible tomorrow that this thing will jump over and inhabit a desk or a professor or some other inanimate thing? You can't. It's defined by its nature as an attribute of living objects. You can't depart from the sum of your knowledge on an arbitrary somehow. That's the whole issue of the onus of proof. So I would reject the question. If somebody says it's possible, what's his basis? All he would be actually doing is finding another type of living thing then. A desk with a soul, so to speak, would be completely different from this thing on the left. What it would be like, I haven't the faintest clue. Can you tell me if Capoletti is still painting and if he shows his work in any New York galleries? I don't know. I haven't heard about him for a long time. I believe he's in Spain, but I'm not sure. Will Miss Rand be speaking at the Fort Hall Forum in the future? I think so, but she doesn't have any specific plans, but I certainly would not rule that out as a possibility. I have some more, but I'll take from the floor if you want to ask them orally. At the back, yes.
Can we go back to a paragraph in the last page?
Just let me get it out. You want to go back to the exercise? Yes, okay.
Page 19.
Page 19, paragraph 4, right.
Yeah, it seems to me there's an obvious implication that scientific evidence could show that a person's character could be determined by his heredity. The
You say there's an obvious, this is page 19, paragraph 4. There's an obvious implication, you say, that scientific evidence could show that chromosomes, the character is set by heredity. Why is that obvious? He says any evidence is totally lacking. How do you get from that to therefore it's possible?
It implies that there could be evidence to show that it's strictly a scientific issue of evidence that proves that.
In other words, you're arguing as follows, that chromosomes have no effect on character is a purely philosophic issue that you shouldn't appeal to science for at all?
Right.
No, I don't think I would agree with that, unless you make a very specific definition. If you mean by character, those things which specifically depend upon man's free choice, his moral character, then it certainly is true on philosophic grounds that can't be determined, because character depends on ideas, and ideas depend on thought, and that's into epistemology. But that doesn't mean it's irrelevant, even on that level, to say, and on top of this, the very field which deals with chromosomes and genes, there isn't one jot of evidence toward the other side. Now, you see, for instance, conceivably, now I don't say that I have the basis for this, but it might be that some elements of what we sometimes call character might be genetically influenced, like if you have a lethargic or a more active temperament or that type of thing. That's not character as he means it, but I'm simply saying this. It is not irrelevant to appeal to science and say, if you're talking about a biological issue, not only is my view true philosophically, there isn't one jot of evidence from this science to support it, of actual evidence. I don't believe that commits him to saying science could prove the opposite. And I don't think in this kind of case you lose anything by simply saying science has absolutely no base here. You think you're opening it, in effect, to the scientist could come in tomorrow and say character is determined by chromosomes.
Well, I think he's implying that the proof lies in scientific evidence.
Well, if he's implying that the proof lies in scientific evidence, that's wrong. But I didn't take it that way, because his preceding paragraph, he gave a purely philosophic argument. And therefore, I took this as simply corroboration rather than as an independent argument. Yes?
I had the same impression as the last questioner, particularly from the phrase, in the context of today's biological knowledge. And I wondered whether it couldn't be gotten around by putting it, the whole thing could be put in the negative, the alleged claims to evidence of scientific nature are false.
I see. In other words, you're suggesting that in order to foreclose entirely the possibility of leaving open this question, and maybe science could someday prove it, and yet include his intention of denying that science does it, simply put it in the negative. Instead of saying in the context of today's biological knowledge there's no basis, saying all the claims are arbitrary and baseless. Okay, I don't really mind the appeal to facts. I'm not, per se an enemy of that, but I grant you, two questioners, that if you did take it that way, it sounds like if tomorrow some mad biologist comes in and says the latest findings, of the federal government's biology department is this, it may leave it open. I think you mean that it's just corroboration, right? Not as the whole case, yes. Yes?
Short question. Has a publication date been set for the Analyses parallel?
I was saving that. No, a publication date has not been set for the ominous parallels. I guess I didn't get away without answering that.
What's the problem?
I was asked, what's the problem? I can't set a date because I've been wrong too many times. There's really not very much left. Actually to do. I finished it. I've got to the end. Cut the overwritten parts. There's really only about a chapter and a half left, which require only reorganization. They're written and researched and edited. They just require a certain reorganization, and I can't see that it's more than a couple of months. And from that point of view, there would be no problem in announcing it, except I've been wrong so many times that on the principle of induction, I don't think anyone would believe me. So, to the best of my knowledge, it should be completed entirely this summer, and then you have to add in 6 to 8 months for the publisher to bring it out. So it would be next, I wouldn't even say.
The other question has to do with the NBC moving forward with any plans to make Atlas?
Oh, with regard to the movie of Atlas, that is quiescent as far as I know at this time. It's not with NBC now. You can look that up in Variety, the whole story on that. But there are other possibilities being discussed about the project, but whether they're going to materialize, I don't know. It's no, it's who knows what the date of that issue? Do you know, Harry?
It's the June or July of last year.
June or July of last year in Variety, there was a whole story which was quite accurate. Last year being 1979. This is for people who are hearing this in 1982. There's one on Iran here that I would really like to say something about, but I can't justify it because it has nothing to do with communication. And philosophy does not have a foreign policy. So I better pass on that, I guess. Well, I'll just make it very brief. This question is asked a week following the abortive attempt to free the hostages. And I think that that raid is a perfect example of President Carter and his entire approach to all questions, domestic and international. The best comment I saw on that alleged raid was by William Safire in the New York Times yesterday, which is April 28, 1980, in which he made the point that this raid is a typical Carter maneuver because he was told, in effect, or it was understood, that a much more major invasion was necessary if they were going to be able to succeed, and that helicopters are very unreliable, and that there was no real chance of success if they went in with 8 when they needed 6 as a minimum. But that if he had made it a bigger raid of the size that would have been required to succeed, it would have unequivocally committed him to a course of action which could have resulted in bloodshed and unhappy feelings generally. And he wanted at all costs to avoid this, and that this was understood by the people, the commanders in the field, who in effect went into the raid with the understanding that if they did get into Tehran and then trouble materialized, there would be no support whatever from the White House. There'd be no airstrike, there'd be no military backup, and they would be slaughtered. And that therefore they went into it on the understanding this is in effect a PR exercise. This is not Safire's words, but this is the essence of his column. This was a PR exercise designed to show the country they were, quote, doing something without causing any trouble. And everybody involved in it knew that, and therefore they went entirely by the book. And the moment the second plane or the third plane went out, they canceled the mission and came back. Well, and that the whole thing was therefore completely nonsense. It was exactly on a par with the Carter claim that we have to reduce the budget, you know, because government spending is so bad. And then he finds some position, allegedly a gesture to reduce the budgetary expense without upsetting, or his brilliant thing on the military, which is to say we have to increase military spending by 3% to show that he's a hawk and next year. And then this year he reduces spending so that next year when we increase it 3%, we're back to where we started this year. And then he can say, I raised the budget 3%. Now this is in effect inaction, cosmetics, PR, masquerading as tidbits thrown to the public to show that he's not really an unadulterated zero. But he actually is, and it's monstrous to run a country this way, and he has made the United States the laughingstock of the whole world by this policy in Iran. And my own suggestion would be that if the next president, the next candidate wants to win, he should run on the platform that his defense secretary will be an Israeli. In which case there might be a chance of pulling off a raid. And now the question that was actually asked here is, would you comment on the attempt? Diplomatic approach seems hopeless, so what should we do? That's where all you could say philosophically is you should never have got into this position. Once you're in, speaking for myself now, not for Ms. Rand or for objectivism, couldn't see any solution other than a military solution in full scale, and that should have been done immediately. But the knowledge that that would have been possible would have prevented the whole thing to begin with. So, but what should you do in a situation where no one will believe you when you resort to military measures, and you yourself ensure that those measures are going to fail because you don't want to ruffle the feelings of the enemy or of the doves? There is no answer to that. There's nothing that you can do. So, are there any other questions on the exercises? All right, I'll take a few last written questions here. During your course, The Philosophy of Objectivism, someone asks if it is ever proper to lie. You answer with a sweeping no. That's not true. Yet Ms. Rand holds that morality ceases at the point of a gun. Would you please elaborate? It is entirely correct to lie at the point of a gun. You misunderstood me if you think I say it's always wrong to lie. I make the point explicitly there that there are circumstances under which you're entitled to lie, and one of them is absolutely at the point of a gun. So this is a misunderstanding. Now, there are a lot of questions been asked about various moral issues which take us completely outside of this course, so I have to pass them by, but on that one I have to say that was a misunderstanding. In several lectures, you seem to be approving of or even recommending the technique of pretending to forget words or phrasing in order to appear to be more extemporaneous. To me, this would be dishonest. Please comment. Well, you could call it dishonest. I don't think it's dishonest. It is a certain pretense, but I would name it differently. I would say what you're actually doing, if you follow that technique, is reenacting the initial thought process. You are putting on a certain kind of performance, which is you're letting the audience go at the same rate that you would have gone if you were thinking on your feet. So you're giving them the virtues of an extemporaneous performance, not by cheating them, but by going through where you would have paused at the time it would have occurred to you. Now, if I pause deliberately like that, it is not to put one over on the audience. Primarily, the purpose is because I would hesitate exactly at the point where, when I was thinking of the thing originally, I would stop. If I'm thinking how to formulate something, and I can't think of the word because it's a new twist in the development of the thought, and I have to pause for a second, then that pause is just the pause the audience would need in order to be able to follow the logic of my answer. And therefore, that pause is actually helpful to them. They need it just as I need it. And it simply is an issue of art. I don't think it's any more dishonest, actually, than if an actor who knows his lines says them as though he's thinking of them at the time. There is a certain element of that, I think, in a proper extemporaneous performance. That is, if you already have it all prepared, there's a certain curse on that, I think. And it's harder to follow, and it's better to try to bring it into the form of an extemporaneous delivery. In any event, I do that, and if you feel defrauded, I can't do anything about it. Two last questions. One is on arguing possibility. It is a principle of objectivist epistemology, as I understand it, that evidence must be submitted even to assert that something is possible, and that if a hypothesis or possibility is raised without such evidence, one can legitimately dismiss it out of hand. Is one then justified in holding that the unsupported claim is impossible? One example might be the argument that there is life on other planets. No, you could not say, so-and-so claimed that life on another planet is possible. His claim was arbitrary and unsupported, therefore I know it is impossible. Because you can't go from the absence of proof to the claim that therefore it is impossible. Maybe you just lack the evidence of the phenomenon, and in a future state of knowledge you will find that it exists. Now, the full elaboration of this is in one of my lectures, I believe number 6 in the course on objectivism. But in essence, possible and impossible are both cognitive assessments of a certain claim. They're like true and false, possible and impossible, likely and unlikely. There's a whole bunch of different assessments. Objectivism's point is that any such assessment can be used only where there is a framework of evidence. If there's no evidence, the original claim has to be thrown out altogether. Not that its negation is then endorsed, but the whole subject is simply thrown out as arbitrary and outside the realm of cognition. So if somebody says, maybe there's a gremlin in the back of this room, it's possible. My method and strategy and epistemology is not to say that's impossible. I simply say that's outside of the principles of human cognition. That's an arbitrary declaration, invalid and out. I don't say true, false, possible, impossible. To give it such an assessment is already to give it a compliment, is to say you have brought this legitimately within the realm of human cognition, and now does the evidence point this way or that way? In actual fact, if it's arbitrary, it's beneath, well, it's beneath contempt, but it's beneath discussion, it's beneath evaluation. And you'll find that that's much more effective than to be trapped by somebody else's arbitrariness into making an arbitrary claim yourself. At the back, yes.
How does that relate to the issue of metaphysical versus epistemological possibility?
Say it again.
How does that relate to the issue of metaphysical versus epistemological possibility?
How does that relate to the issue of metaphysical versus epistemological possibility? I'm talking here about epistemological possibility. By metaphysical, you mean that there are certain things you can say are impossible because by their nature they involve a contradiction. But that then is a certain kind of argument. You could say, for instance, if you mean by God creator of the universe, if that's what you mean, and by the universe you mean the totality of everything, then the idea of a creator of the totality is a contradiction. And therefore that's impossible. You see, that would be an argument that something is impossible by its nature. But suppose somebody says to you, it's possible that there's a God. And you say, what do you mean by God? He says, I don't know. Prove that it's impossible. Well, if he doesn't know what he means, you can't prove that it's impossible. You can't discuss it. It's outside of knowledge completely then. So you simply have to say that claim is invalid, that's arbitrary, out. It's neither possible nor impossible. Yeah.
Is your study guide to objectivism still available?
Yes, my study guide to objectivism is available through Palo Alto Book Service. It's available in a second edition, revised and brought up to date, or at that time, with the assistance of David Kelly.
The writer on racism brought up capitalism at the end of his essay. If for somebody who's a layperson might equate capitalism with racism, not from that essay, but let's say from South Africa. Is there an objectivist policy towards South Africa?
First of all, you say someone reading that paper might equate capitalism with racism because of South Africa.
No, but just the mention of capitalism and in an essay about racism.
Well, if the mention about capitalism, the mere mention about capitalism in an essay on racism raised the specter of South Africa, the person is so far from your framework that it's very debatable that you could present the paper or any paper to him because he's really far out in terms of his viewpoint. South Africa is certainly not a capitalist country is very far from that. Any country which has a mandated separation of the races is 10,000 miles away from individualism or anything remotely like capitalism. And of course, it's a very controlled mixed economy with the welfare state and the whole business. So in that regard, any pro-capitalist has to oppose the policies in South Africa. But I object to the question only because you could just as plausibly say that of racism all around the world. That's equally true in Britain. It's widespread in Soviet Russia. So if you're going to invoke racist countries, South Africa is an extreme example of a racist country, but remember also, racism is one concrete under the wider phenomenon of collectivism. And if what motivates people is concern for human life and rights, Russia is much more evil by that standard, or Nazi Germany, than South Africa. I'm not any friend of or admirer of the policies in South Africa, but I oppose the idea of everybody denouncing South Africa and nobody saying a word about Russia. If there was just even parity, one denunciation of Russia to one of South Africa, that would be fair. Given that one has a dictatorship which is, I don't know, consumed how many millions in actual concentration camps. So if you detect that I object to your question, it's on that grounds. But I don't think, to take your question literally, that anybody could legitimately equate South Africa with capitalism. If they do, they're completely ignorant and they're ignoring what it actually said in the paper about what capitalism is. So it's a Marxist view of capitalism. The Marxist view was that fascism or racism is the end result of capitalism, allegedly proven by Hitler. For a refutation of that, you could read my book. Do I have another question? When? Yeah, soon. All right, I'll just answer this one last question. Please excuse such a personal question, but I can no longer bear the curiosity. How old are you? Older than you think. 46. Thank you very much.